Directly to jail again. Either you're cheating or this game is rigged. Fine. Who was Fannie Lou Hamer? From Megan. Well, on August 22, 1964, a lot of Americans were asking that same question. That night, they turned on a TV to see Hamer on every news program. She looked like a nice middle aged lady, somebody's mom or your neighbor. But in her home state of Mississippi, she was well known as a fierce voting rights advocate. For the past 2 years, she's been fighting to get African Americans access to the polls. The Constitution said that the right to vote could be denied due to race. But southern states have found sorts of ways to get around the law. Stripping of the right to vote, black southerners had no voice in a racist system. To try to fight it, you face jail time, intimidation, and violence. Hamer had experienced it all, and in that night she shared her story. And it was just a few minutes long but full of hardship and of brutality. And the viewers who never heard of her before wept. And overnight she went being from a local activist to a national civil rights leader. Hamer was born in Mississippi in 1917, the youngest of 20 children. Her grandmother had been enslaved, and her parents, like many descendants of enslaved people, were sharecroppers. A plantation owner rented them farmland in exchange for a share of the crops, but he also charged high rates for tools and other expenses. So, like most sharecroppers, they were constantly in debt. Hamer had to leave school after sixth grade but to help her family in the fields. As an adult, she earned a position of responsibility on a plantation. She recorded each farmer's harvest and tried to get them their fair share. Then, in August 1962, the members of the Students Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, visited her church. All around the country, the civil rights movement was heating all the way up, and it's one of its major players. It is students activists and local community leaders but to join the fight. In Mississippi, they focused on registering black voters. They told the congregation they could sweep out raised officials. Hamer was stunned. She didn't even know that she had the right to vote. So when they asked for volunteers to register to vote, she raised her hand all the way up high. No, it wasn't that simple. And an angry crowd gathered at the courthouse to meet the 18 volunteers. They tried to scare Hamer and the others from even trying to register. But the volunteers stuck together and made their way in. Inside the courthouse, the clerk was no more welcoming. He demanded the group to pass a test before registering. They were asked to explain a legal clause about the ex facto laws. Exactly, that was the whole point of literacy tests, to be nearly impossible to pass, so clerks can refuse anyone the right to vote. They also demand a poll tax, a fee meant to discourage would-be voters. No surprise, all the SNCC volunteers failed the literacy test. And on the way home, their bus was stopped by the police. They said its yellow color was illegal. Hamer sang a song to keep the group's spirits up until they were let go. That night, she was fired from her job and evicted from her home. The plantation owner had heard about her attempt to register. A few nights later, somebody shot at the house where she was staying. Afraid for her children, Hamer considered leaving town for good. But she could not convince herself but to leave the place that her parents helped build. She rented a house from a neighbor and took a job with a SNCC committee. Hamer's home became a gathering place for volunteers and civil rights leaders. And among them, she stood out. She wasn't male, young, well-educated, or a middle class. She knew what poor black families endured because she lived it. That first-hand experience made her a powerful speaker. She will often break into song to motivate crowds. Before long, she was well known for her singing voice as her activity, but her growing influence made her a target for racist attacks. She got threatening letters and phone calls, and her husband lost job after a job. Somebody threw the bomb at her house, though luckily it failed to explode. Then, in June 1963, Hamer and six fellow activists were arrested. They tried to eat at a only diner. Local police held them for 3 days, beating and torturing them. Hamer's kidneys were permanently damaged, and she lost sight in one eye. Hamer and other activists realized the legal authorities were not going to change unless they were forced to. So, in 1964, they started a massive voter registration drive called Freedom Summer, and it brought hundreds of mostly white college students down to Mississippi. They went door to door registering black voters. It was dangerous work. 3 volunteers were being dead in the first week. The nation could no longer ignore what was happening in Mississippi. For the rest of the summer, stories of beatings and shootings made headlines all around the country. And at the end of August, Hamer and other activists went to Atlantic City, New Jersey. That was the site of the Democratic National Convention. The big event where the party chose its nominee for president. Each state sends a group of people to cast the official vote. And no surprise, Mississippi's representatives were all white. Hamer's group was there to challenge their authority. So the state executed black voters. They said the declaration was illegal. There are Mississippi Shoe representatives and they have voter registrations, but to prove it. The protest caused a lot of noise. Hamer was giving a lot to speak. Before a national audience, she described what she had endured simply for trying to vote, being threatened and shot at by fellow citizens, being beaten by the police. She challenged the nation to consider for its own values. Hamer, is this America, the land of the free, of the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hooks, because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live in a decent human beings in America. Her testimony replayed on the news for days. No, Hamer and her group were not seated at the convention. But a year later, President Lyndon Johnson was signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and they outlawed all kinds of barriers to voting, like literacy tests and poll taxes. And at the convention in 1968, Hamer was chosen to be an official Democratic National Convention delegate. She received a standing ovation. Hamer's activity continued way past her primetime moment. She fought for women's rights and protested the Vietnam War and ran for office several times. She founded the Freedom Farm, a cooperative to help black farmers to climb out of poverty. Before her death in 1977, she was buried there. Yeah, I guess it is your turn to roll.